The call came on a Tuesday, right when I had my arms elbow-deep in the transmission of a Peterbilt 379 that had been giving us trouble for 2 weeks straight. My phone buzzed against the concrete floor where I tossed it with my jacket, and I almost let it go to voicemail. Would have saved me from knowing what I know now. From lying awake at night watching shadows move across my ceiling in this Phoenix apartment, clears throat, wondering if distance means anything to something like that. But I didn't let it ring out. Something made me wipe the grease off my hands and check the screen. And when I saw the 815 area code, my stomach did that little flip it always did when Illinois came calling. Only 2 people had that number. My grandmother and the attorney who handled my grandfather's estate when he passed 6 years back. The attorney didn't call anymore, so that left Grandma Mira, Victor. Her voice was thin, ready in a way I hadn't heard before. She was 87 years old and still sharper than most folks half her age. But right then, she sounded every year of it and then some. I need you to come home. Home. Funny how she still called it that, even though I'd left that farm when I was 19 and never looked back, except in memories. Home was the rolling hills outside Galena, the creek that cut through the back 40 acres, the corn fields that stretched to the horizon like an ocean of green and gold, depending on the season. Home was also the place my father died when I was 12. Tractor accident, they said, though I remember the casket was closed and my mother wouldn't stop shaking for months after. What happened? I asked, already knowing it was bad. Grandma Mira didn't ask for help. She was the kind of woman who set her own broken finger with a popsicle stick and medical tape, who birthed calves in snowstorms and once shot a rabid dog from 50 yards with an old rifle that should have been in a museum. Fell, she said, and I heard the shame in it, the frustration. Hips broken. Doctor says I need surgery, then someone to help while I recover. Could be 6 weeks, 8 weeks. I don't. She stopped and I heard her breathing measured and deliberate like she was fighting something back. I don't want to go to one of those places, Victor. Not yet. Not while I can still see the fields from my kitchen window. I looked around the shop at the Peterbilt with its guts spread across the floor, at Martinez cursing at a hydraulic line in the corner, at the gray Oregon sky pressing down through the dirty skylights. HRI's logging had been good to me for almost 20 years, but it wasn't like I had roots here. Divorced 3 years now, no kids, living in a trailer that still smelled like cigarettes from the previous tenant, no matter how much I cleaned. My social life consisted of Sunday phone calls with my grandmother and occasional beers with Ray, who worked the scaling station and liked to talk about his ex-wife more than was healthy. "I'll be there by Friday," I said. She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had that old steel in it. "Bring warm clothes. Spring's late this year." And Victor, another pause. "The dogs have been acting strange. I'm sure it's nothing, but keep an eye on them, would you?" I didn't think much of it at the time. Dogs act strange for 1,000 reasons. Maybe they'd seen a fox, or there was a storm coming they could sense. Grandma Mira had 2 German shepherds, Rex and Kaiser. Both of them descended from a line my grandfather had bred for 40 years. Smart dogs, brave dogs, the kind that would face down a bear if they had to. Whatever was bothering them, I figured I'd sort it out. I told Martinez I needed family leave, cleared it with the foreman, and spent Wednesday packing up my trailer. Didn't take long. 43 years old and everything I owned fit in the bed of my truck with room to spare. Some clothes, some tools, a box of photographs I never looked at but couldn't throw away. Ray stopped by that night with a six-pack, and we sat on my porch watching the rain drip off the pine trees that pressed close around the trailer park. "Illinois, huh?" Ray cracked his second beer and shook his head. "Flat as a pancake out there, isn't it? How do people stand it? It's not so bad." I wasn't sure why I was defending a place I'd run from half my life ago. Different kind of pretty. "The sky is bigger when there's nothing blocking it. You coming back?" I shrugged. The truth was I didn't know. The job would still be here. They were always short on mechanics who could handle the big rigs, but whether I wanted it was another question. Maybe it was time for a change. 43 felt like an age, where you either settled into what you were or you made one last run at something different. I just didn't know which one I wanted yet. I left before dawn on Thursday. the sky still dark and the roads wet with overnight rain. The drive took 18 hours across 5 states, and I watched the landscape change from the green-black dens of Oregon's forests to the browns and tans of the high desert, then the rolling grasslands of Wyoming, the agricultural monotony of Nebraska, and finally the Mississippi River marking the border into Illinois. Like a promise I wasn't sure I wanted kept, I crossed into Joe Daviess County just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in oranges and purples that reflected off the ponds and creeks dotting the landscape. The farms out here were old, some of them dating back to the 1840s when lead miners had settled the area before discovering the soil was worth more than whatever was underneath it. Stone fences lined the roads, half collapsed with age, and the houses were set back from the highway, like they wanted to keep their distance from the modern world. Grandma's place sat at the end of a gravel road that wound through a stand of old oaks before opening up to reveal the farmhouse, the barn, and the fields beyond. The house was a 2-story Victorian that my great-grandfather had built, white clapboard with green shutters and a wraparound porch that creaked in all the places I remembered. The barn was newer, metal-sided, built in the 70s to replace the wooden one that had burned down before I was born. I pulled up just as the last light was fading from the sky, and that's when I noticed the first wrong thing. Rex and Kaiser were on the porch. That wasn't unusual. They always greeted visitors there, standing guard until they determined whether you were friend or foe. What was unusual was how they were standing, pressed against the front door, hackles raised, whining low in their throats. They barely looked at me as I got out of the truck. Their attention was fixed on the tree line to the east where the oaks gave way to the corn field that wouldn't be planted for another month. "Hey, boys," I said, approaching slowly. "What's got you spooked?" Kaiser, the older of the two, finally turned to look at me. His eyes were wide, showing white around the edges, and when I reached out to pet him, he flinched. In all the years I'd known that dog, I had never seen him flinch from anything. The front door opened before I could think too hard about it. Grandma Mira stood there with a walker, her face pale but her eyes sharp. She'd lost weight since I'd last seen her at Christmas 2 years ago. And there were more lines around her mouth, but she was still recognizable as the woman who taught me to fish and shoot and drive a tractor before I was tall enough to reach the pedals. "You made good time," she said. "Come in. The dogs won't settle until you're inside." I grabbed my bag from the truck and followed her in. And the moment the door closed behind me, Rex and Kaiser finally relaxed. They slunk to their beds by the wood stove and lay down, but their ears stayed prick-ricked, rotating like satellite dishes toward every creak and groan of the old house. "What's wrong with them?" I asked, setting my bag by the stairs. Grandma Mira was already making her slow way toward the kitchen, the walker clicking against the hardwood floors. "Coffee's fresh. You look like you could use some, Grandma." She stopped, not turning around. The set of her shoulders told me something I didn't want to know. "The coyotes have been wrong," she said finally, making sounds I've never heard, "and the cattle won't graze at night anymore. They just stand there in the middle of the pasture like they're waiting for something." She turned then and her eyes found mine. "Your grandfather used to say this land had moods that sometimes it wanted to be left alone. This is one of those times, Victor. I'm glad you're here, but I wish you didn't have to be." I didn't know what to say to that. My grandfather had been a practical man, a farmer and a mechanic like me, not given to mysticism or fancy. If he'd said the land had moods, he would have meant something about the weather or the soil composition. Not whatever Grandma Mira seemed to be implying. "It's probably just the pain medication," I said, and immediately wished I hadn't. Her eyes went flat and cold. "I'm not senile, Victor, and I'm not drugged. I know what I've been hearing, and so do those dogs. Now come have your coffee and tell me about Oregon. We'll deal with the rest tomorrow." We sat at the kitchen table until nearly midnight talking about everything and nothing. She told me about the neighbors. Old man Horvath had lost his wife in January. The Petersons had sold their back 40 to a developer from Chicago. The church was looking for a new pastor after Reverend Hollings retired. I told her about the logging trucks and the Oregon rain, and how I'd almost adopted a dog from the shelter before deciding my trailer was too small. We didn't talk about my divorce or my father or whatever was making the dogs press their noses against the crack under the front door, sniffing and whining and refusing to sleep. When I finally went to bed in my old room, clear as throat, unchanged since I was 19, except for a new quilt. On the bed, I lay awake for a long time listening. The farmhouse made all the sounds old houses make. Settling timbers whined against the windows, the click and hum of the heating system kicking on. But underneath those familiar noises, there was something else. An absence, maybe a silence where sound should have been. I got up and went to the window. The moon was 3/4 full, bright enough to cast shadows across the yard and the fields beyond. I could see the cattle in the pasture. And Grandma Mirror was right. They weren't grazing. They were standing in a tight cluster at the center of the field, all facing the same direction, facing the tree and facing the darkness where the oaks grew thick and the underbrush swallowed the moonlight. I watched for a long time, waiting for them to move. They didn't. Finally, I convinced myself I was being ridiculous. City living had made me soft, paranoid. The cattle were probably just reacting to some predator scent on the wind. A coyote or a fox or maybe a feral dog. In the morning, I'd walk the fence line and look for tracks. I'd find something ordinary, something that made sense, and we'd all have a good laugh about the city boy jumping at shadows. I went back to bed and eventually fell asleep, but my dreams were strange and formless. Impressions of darkness and weight and something watching from a place I couldn't see. The next morning, I woke to the smell of bacon and the sound of Grandma Mira moving around the kitchen despite her walker. I found her at the stove stubbornly flipping eggs one-handed while Rex and Kaiser watched with the focus of dogs who know food is involved. "You should be resting," I said. "I should be dead, according to my last 3 doctors." She slid the eggs onto a plate and handed Clear's throat it to me. "Sit, eat, then you can start being useful." I sat. The kitchen was the same as I remembered. White cabinets gone slightly yellow with age. Linoleum floor in a pattern that had been out of style for 30 years. A window over the sink that looked out at the barn and the fields beyond. Through that window, I could see the cattle finally grazing, moving in their slow, methodical way across the pasture. Whatever had spooked them last night seemed to have passed. "Better this morning," I said, nodding toward the window. Grandma Mira didn't look up from her own plate. They always are during the day. I let that slide, focusing on my food. After breakfast, I helped her with the morning chores. Nothing she couldn't have done herself before the hip, but impossible now with the walker and the pain. We fed the chickens, checked the water for the cattle, and I cleaned out the gutters on the barn that had gotten clogged with leaves, normal farm work, the kind I'd grown up doing. And by noon, I'd almost convinced myself that the strangeness of last night had been exhaustion and imagination. Then I walked to the fence line. The back 40 bordered the creek, a ribbon of water that wound down from the hills before eventually joining the Galena River miles to the south. The creek bed was muddy from the spring thaw, soft enough to hold tracks clearly. Deer had been through. I saw their neat split hoof prints everywhere. Raccoons, too, their hand-like prints clustered near the water's edge, and something else. I crouched down, staring at the track. It was canine. That much was clear. 4 toes, claw marks at the front. But the size was wrong. I laid my hand next to it for comparison, and my fingers barely covered half the print. A dog this size would have to be 200 lb, maybe more. The deepest part of the impression, where the pad had pressed into the mud, was nearly an inch deep. Distorted, I said out loud, needing to hear a rational explanation in my own voice. "The mud's soft. It spread as the weight pressed down. That's all." But I'd been tracking animals since I could walk, and I knew what distortion looked like. This wasn't it. The edges of the print were clean, sharp. Whatever had made this track was exactly as big as the evidence suggested. I followed the prints along the creek bed, noting how they sometimes walked in a neat line, 4-footed, and other times seemed to bunch up in pairs, like something had been moving on 2 legs instead of 4. That made no sense. No animal I knew of switched between quadruped and biped locomotion except apes maybe. And there were no apes in Illinois. The tracks led into the terrain and disappeared on the harder ground. I stood at the edge of the oaks, peering into the shadows, and felt the hairs rise on the back of my neck. The forest here was thick, choked with underbrush and deadfall from last year's storms. Anything could be in there, watching, waiting. A crow called from somewhere deep in the trees, and I jumped hard enough to nearly lose my balance. Then I laughed at myself, shaking my head. This was ridiculous. I was a grown man, 43 years old, scared of a bird. I went back to the house and didn't mention the tracks to Grandmommy. She had enough to worry about with her hip in the upcoming surgery. Instead, I called Ray. "Bigfoot," he said after I described what I'd found. "You've got Bigfoot in Illinois. Better call the tabloids. I'm serious, Rye. These tracks were huge. And I'm serious, too. You're in farm country, Victor. Probably some big mastiff or something from one of the neighbors. Those things can get up to 200 lb easy." "What neighbor?" I looked out the window at the field stretching to every horizon. The nearest house was 2 miles away. And why would their dog be skulking around a creek bed at night? Dogs wander, you know that. Look, you've been driving for 2 days and you're in a spooky old farmhouse with your grandma who's clearly been watching too many horror movies. Give it a week, you'll find out it's nothing. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe him so badly that I almost convinced myself right then and there. Rye was right. I was tired, stressed, and unfamiliar with the local wildlife after so many years in Oregon. There was a rational explanation. There was always a rational explanation. I spent the rest of the day helping Grandma Mira prepare for her surgery, which was scheduled for Monday at the hospital in Duke. We went through her medications, made a list of groceries, called her insurance company about the coverage details, normal tasks, grounding tasks. By dinner time, I'd almost forgotten about the tracks. Then the sun went down and the dogs started again. They were at the front door, pressing against it, whining. I went to let them out, assuming they needed to relieve themselves. And the moment I cracked the door, they both backed up, tails between their legs. Kaiser actually growled, not at me but at the darkness beyond the porch. "Fine," I said, "hold it then." But as I started to close the door, I noticed something. Silence, complete, absolute silence. No crickets, no frogs, no night birds. In spring in Illinois, the nights should have been a symphony of sound. Peepers in every pond, crickets in every field, owls in every tree. Instead, there was nothing. Just the wind and the creak of the house and the rapid panning of 2 terrified dogs. I stepped out onto the porch, ignoring the way Rex and Kaiser pressed against my legs, trying to force me back inside. The moon wasn't up yet, but there was enough starlight to see the yard, the barn, the edge of the treeing. Everything looked normal. Everything looked peaceful. I reached for the cigarettes in my pocket, a habit I'd quit 3 times and never quite shaken, and lit one. The flame of my lighter briefly illuminating my face before I clicked it shut. The smoke tasted harsh and chemical, but it gave me something to focus on besides the silence. That's when I saw the eyes. They were at the tree line, maybe 50 yards away. 2 points of greenish gold light reflecting my porch light back at me. Just eyes, nothing else visible, floating in the darkness between the oaks. I froze. The cigarette burned, forgotten between my fingers. Eyes, I told myself. Deer eyes, an animal reflecting light. Nothing unusual about that. Deer were everywhere out here. They came out at night to graze at the edges of fields. This was normal. This was ordinary, but the height was wrong. I grew up on this farm. I knew every tree in that line, knew their heights and shapes and the way they framed the sky. Whatever was looking at me was standing, not on a slope, not on a rise, with its eyes at least 7 ft off the ground, maybe higher. Deer didn't get that tall. Neither did dogs or coyotes or any damn thing that belonged in Illinois. The eyes blinked slowly, deliberately, then they rose higher as if whatever owned them had stood up from a crouch. I dropped my cigarette. Behind me, both dogs let out a sound I'd never heard from a German shepherd, a high keening whine that was almost a scream. I backed toward the door, unable to look away from those eyes. Those wrong height, impossible eyes that tracked my movement with an intelligence I could feel across the distance between us. The eyes blinked again, then they were gone. I don't remember going inside. I don't remember locking the door, or the way I sat with my back against it for an hour, or the way Grandma Mira found me there when she got up for her midnight medication. I just remember those eyes and the height and the absolute certainty that whatever had been watching me had chosen to leave, that it could have done something else. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my window and watched the tree line until dawn, and the eyes never came back. But when the sun rose and I walked out to where I'd seen them, I found something in the soft earth between the roots of an old oak. Footprints, canine, massive, and next to them, pressed deep into the soil, the unmistakable shape of a handprint, 5 fingers, long palm, except the fingers ended in points, not the rounded tips of human digits. I stared at that print for a long time. Then I went inside and poured myself 3 fingers of my grandfather's whiskey even though it was barely 7 in the morning. Something was wrong here. Something I couldn't explain, couldn't rationalize, couldn't dismiss with tired eyes and city paranoia. And I had a very bad feeling that it was only beginning. The whiskey burned going down, but it didn't touch the cold knot that had formed in my chest. I stood at the kitchen sink, staring out at the tree line without really seeing it. My grandfather's glass clutched in a hand that wouldn't stop trembling. The morning light was bright and clean, the kind of light that should have burned away the fears of the night like mist. But it didn't. That handprint was still out there, pressed into the earth between the roots of that oak. Those tracks were still there, evidence that something had been watching me, something that couldn't exist. I poured another drink and then stopped myself, setting the glass down hard enough to crack the bottom against the counter. Getting drunk wasn't going to help. Getting drunk was what got my father killed. According to family whispers I wasn't supposed to have heard. I needed to think. I needed to be rational. Behind me, Rex and Kaiser were finally asleep, curled together on their beds by the wood stove. They'd spent the entire night pressed against the front door, and now they were exhausted, their legs twitching with dreams I didn't want to imagine. I envied them that sleep. I envied them. The ability to close their eyes and let the world fade away, even temporarily. Grandma Mira's walker clicked against the floor as she made her way into the kitchen. She looked at the whiskey bottle, looked at me, and said nothing. Just went to the coffee pot and poured herself a cup with the careful movements of someone managing constant pain. "You saw something," she said, not a question. I turned to face her. "You knew. I knew something was out there. Didn't know what." She lowered herself into a chair at the kitchen table, grimacing as her hip protested. "Your grandfather saw things too near the end. Wouldn't talk about it. Just started locking the doors at sunset and wouldn't let the dogs out after dark. What things? What did he see?" She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and stared into it like it held answers. "He never said. I'd find him sometimes sitting at the window in the middle of the night watching the treeing. Same as you're doing now. When I'd ask him what was wrong, he'd just say, 'It's back,' and wouldn't explain further. But toward the end, he seemed less afraid. Not relaxed, nothing like that, but like he'd figured something out, made some kind of peace with it that I never fully understood. Back, I repeated, as if it had been here before. This land has been in our family for 150 years, Victor. Lot of history in that time. Lot of stories that don't make it into the county records." I wanted to press her to demand she tell me everything she knew or suspected, but the pain lines around her eyes stopped me. She was 87 years old with a broken hip and surgery in 3 days. Whatever secrets this land held, they could wait until she was stronger, or at least that's what I told myself. "I'm going to check the property," I said. "Look for signs of what might have made those tracks. Victor." Her voice stopped me at the door. "Be careful and be back before dark." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and stepped out into the morning. The farmhouse sat on a slight rise, giving me a clear view of the surrounding land. To the north, the fields stretched flat and brown, not yet planted. To the south, the cattle pasture rolled gently toward the creek to the east where I'd seen the eyes. The tree line marked the boundary between our property and state forest land that ran for miles in every direction. To the west, the gravel road wound away toward the highway and the town of Galena beyond. I started with the tree line. In daylight, the oaks looked ordinary, old, certainly. Some of them had been here when Lincoln was a lawyer in Springfield, but just trees, bark and branches, and the first green buds of spring. I found the spot where I'd seen the eyes easily enough. The handprint was still there, perfectly preserved in the morning dew, and I crouched beside it, studying the details I'd been too shaken to notice before. 5 fingers definitely, but the proportions were wrong. The palm was too long, the fingers too narrow, and those pointed tips. I traced the outline with my own finger, careful not to disturb the print. Claws. That's what they were, not nails, claws. Whatever had made this print had fingers that ended in claws. I took out my phone and photographed it, then photographed the footprints nearby. In the pictures, they just looked like mud. No scale, no reference point. Anyone I showed them to would think I was making it up or misinterpreting what I'd seen. But I knew what I was looking at. I knew what had been standing here watching me smoke a cigarette. In my grandmother's porch. I just didn't know what to call it. The logical part of my brain was still trying to come up with explanations. A bear, maybe. Black bears had been making a comeback in Illinois. I'd read about it somewhere. They could stand on their hind legs and their paws had 5 toes with claws. That would explain the height, the prints, maybe even the eyes. But bears didn't have hand-shaped prints with distinct fingers. Bears didn't watch houses at night with intelligent eyes. And bears definitely didn't make German shepherds cower like puppies at the mere sight of them. I followed the tracks into the forest. The going was rough. Dead fall and underbrush and patches of mud that sucked at my boots with every step. The tracks continued for maybe 100 yards, sometimes clearly visible, sometimes disappearing on harder ground, then reappearing in the next soft patch. The pattern of movement was unsettling. Sometimes the creature had walked on all fours, the prints evenly spaced in a normal quadruped gait. Other times it had stood upright, leaving only the hind prints in pairs. And once I found a place where it had jumped, the prints showing a deep impact where it had landed, then nothing for nearly 20 ft in any direction. Whatever this thing was, it could move like nothing I'd ever encountered. The tracks ended at a rocky outcropping that thrust up from the forest floor like a gray fist. I circled it twice, looking for any sign of where the creature had gone, but found nothing. It was as if it had simply vanished into thin air. I sat down on a fallen log and tried to think. The sun filtered through the canopy above me, dappling the ground with light and shadow. Somewhere nearby, a woodpecker was drilling into a dead tree, the sound echoing through the forest like a mechanical heartbeat. Normal sounds, daytime sounds, nothing like the absolute silence of last night. A bear. It had to be a bear. A particularly large one, maybe with some kind of deformity that explained the strange prints. I could call the Illinois Department of Natural Resources and report a bear sighting. They'd send someone out to investigate and that would be the end of it. Mystery solved. Rational explanation achieved. I pulled out my phone and started to dial, then stopped because I knew I was lying to myself. Because I knew in the part of my brain that still remembered what it meant to be prey that no bear had been watching me last night. Bears didn't move like that. Bears didn't blink with that kind of deliberate intelligence. Bears didn't make 2 experienced German shepherds lose their minds with fear. I put the phone away and headed back to the house. The rest of the morning I spent on practical tasks trying to keep my mind off what I'd seen. I fixed a broken hinge on the barn door, replaced a section of fence that had rotted through, and helped Grandma Mira organize her medications for the week. She didn't ask me what I'd found in the forest, and I didn't volunteer it. We moved around each other with the careful politeness of people avoiding a difficult conversation. After lunch, I drove into town. Galena was a tourist trap now. All antique shops and bed and breakfasts catering to day trippers from Chicago. But if you knew where to look, you could still find the old town underneath. The hardware store that had been in the same family for 4 generations, the diner where the farmers gathered before dawn for coffee and complaints about the weather. I found a parking spot on Main Street and walked to Peterson's Hardware, hoping old man Peterson was still alive and still as much of a gossip as I remembered. He was 92 years old, bent nearly double over the counter, but his eyes were sharp and his memory sharper. "Victor Starfall," he said when I walked in. "Heard you were back. Mira's hip, isn't it?" "That's right." I leaned against the counter, not sure how to bring up what I really wanted to talk about. "She's doing okay. Surgery's Monday." "Good, good. She's the tough one. Your grandmother always has been." He peered at me with those sharp eyes. "You look like hell, though. Something keeping you up at night?" I hesitated, then decided to take the plunge. "You know anything about strange animals out by our place? Something big. Something that doesn't quite fit." Peterson's face went still. Just for a moment, just a flicker, but I saw it. "Strange how? Big, real big. leaving tracks I can't identify. He was quiet for a long moment, rearranging items on the counter that didn't need rearranging. "There's been talk," he said finally. "Horvath lost some sheep a few weeks back. Something tore them up pretty bad. He said it was coyotes, but he shook his head. I've seen what coyotes do. This wasn't coyotes." "What do you think it was?" "I don't think anything. He met my eyes and there was something in his face. I didn't like fear, maybe, or the memory of fear. And neither should you. Whatever's out there, Victor, it's not our business to understand it. It's our business to stay out of its way. That's what your grandfather always said. You knew about this." "My grandfather talked to you about it, just once after your father died." Peterson turned away, busying himself with a display of drill bits. He came into town looking like death warmed over, asking questions about the old stories. I told him what I knew, which wasn't much. This land was Poti territory before the settlers came. They had names for things in these woods, things they avoided, things they didn't talk about. I felt a chill run down my spine despite the warmth of the store. "What kinds of things?" "The kind that don't exist anymore." He turned back to me and his face was hard. "Go home, Victor. Take care of your grandmother. Lock your doors after dark and don't go looking for trouble. That's my advice. And it's the same advice I gave your grandfather 25 years ago. He listened mostly. You should too." I bought some nails I didn't need and drove home in a daze. The conversation had raised more questions than it answered, but one thing was clear. Whatever I'd seen last night wasn't news to the people who lived here. They knew about it or suspected, and their response was the same universal silence. Don't talk about it, don't acknowledge it. Pretend it doesn't exist and hope it leaves you alone. That might have worked for them, but I'd seen those eyes. I'd seen that handprint. I couldn't pretend. Afternoon passed slowly. I called Ray again, needing to hear a skeptical voice, needing someone to tell me I was being ridiculous. "Let me get this straight," Ray said after I described the tracks, the handprint, and my conversation with Peterson. "You think there's some kind of mystery creature living in the Illinois woods and the locals are covering it up?" "I don't know what I think." "Well, I do. I think you've been watching too many YouTube videos about cryptids and now you're seeing monsters everywhere. It's probably a bear, Victor, or a big dog. Or some homeless guy with long fingernails living in the state forest. A homeless guy with eyes that glow green gold. I shine. Animals do it all the time. That's 7 FT off the ground." Rye was quiet for a moment. "Look, I'm not saying you didn't see something. I'm saying there's a rational explanation for whatever you saw. There always is. You're stressed. You're tired. You're in an unfamiliar environment. Your brain is playing tricks on you." "My brain didn't make those tracks, Ray. No, but your brain interpreted them. You saw something ambiguous and your imagination filled in the blanks." He sighed. "Listen, I've got to go. Martinez is having a meltdown about one of the hydraulic lines. Just try to get some sleep tonight, okay? Things always look different in the morning." I hung up and stared at my phone. Rye meant well. He was a good friend. And in any other circumstance, his logic would have been reassuring. But he hadn't been there. He hadn't seen those eyes. He hadn't felt the intelligence behind them, the weight of being observed by something that understood exactly what it was looking at. The sun was getting low. I helped Grandma with dinner. Soup from a can, bread from the freezer. Nothing fancy, but it was warm and filling. We ate in silence while the light outside slowly faded from gold to orange to purple. Rex and Kaiser woke from their nap as the darkness approached, stretching and yawning before taking up their positions by the front door. "You should sleep in the back bedroom tonight," Grandma Mira said, breaking the silence. "It doesn't have a window facing the trees. I'm fine in my old room." She looked at me with eyes that had seen 87 years of life and probably more than a few things she'd never spoken of. "No, you're not, but you're stubborn just like your grandfather, just like your father." She rose from the table, leaning heavily on her walker. "Lock the doors, all of them, and Victor." She paused at the doorway. "Don't go outside tonight. No matter what you hear, no matter what you see." I locked the doors, all of them. The front door, the back door, the door from the kitchen to the mudroom, even the cellar door that led to the old root cellar my great-grandfather had dug 150 years ago. I checked the windows, making sure they were latched. I moved through the house like a man preparing for a siege, and maybe I was. Then I sat at my bedroom window and waited. The moon rose around 10, 0, not quite full but bright enough to cast shadows across the yard. The cattle were clustered again, standing motionless in the center of the pasture, facing the treeing. Rex and Kaiser were whining at the front door, a constant low sound that wore on my nerves like sandpaper. I watched the tree line, my eyes straining in the darkness, looking for any sign of movement. For 2 hours, nothing happened. I was starting to think maybe Ray was right. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing when I saw it. Eyes, those same greenish-gold points of light reflecting the moonlight. HT from the edge of the trees, higher than last night, I thought. Or maybe it was just my imagination. I watched, barely breathing, as they blinked once, twice, 3 times. Then they started moving. Not toward me, parallel to the tree line, moving east toward the back of the property where the creek ran through the oaks. I tracked them with my eyes, my heart pounding so hard. I could feel it in my teeth. The eyes were moving at a walking pace, unhurried, as if whatever owned them had all the time in the world. And then I saw the shape. The moon was behind me, shining toward the trees, and for just a moment the creature passed through a gap in the canopy where the light fell unobstructed. I saw it in silhouette, a black shape against the slightly lighter darkness of the forest beyond. It was huge. I'd been telling myself it was a bear, maybe standing on its hind legs, but this wasn't a bear. The proportions were all wrong. The shoulders were too broad, the arms too long, the head too pointed. It moved with a strange loping gait, sometimes upright, sometimes dropping to all fours. And every time it switched between the two, my brain screamed that this was wrong, this was impossible, this was not how animals moved. I pressed my hand against the cold glass of the window, watching as the shape disappeared into the deeper darkness of the woods. The eyes winked out, hidden by trees, and I was left staring at nothing but shadows. I don't know how long I stood there. Minutes, maybe hours. The moon tracked across the sky, and the cattle eventually lay down in their tight cluster, and Rex and Kaiser stopped whining and started their low, terrified keening again. I stood at the window, unable to look away from the place where I'd seen that silhouette, and I thought about all the things that weren't supposed to exist. Bigfoot, werewolves, dogmen, skinwalkers. I'd heard the stories, seen the TV shows, read the Reddit threads where people claim to have seen impossible things in the forest of America. I'd always dismissed them as hoaxes or misidentifications or simple lies. But now, watching the darkness where something massive had passed, I couldn't dismiss anything anymore because I'd seen it. Not clearly, not well enough to describe in detail, but I'd seen enough. Enough to know that it was real. Enough to know that it wasn't any animal in any field guide. Enough to know that I was in the presence of something I couldn't explain, couldn't understand, and probably couldn't survive if it decided I was a threat. The dawn came eventually, as dawn always do. I hadn't slept. My eyes were gritty with exhaustion and my hands shook when I lifted my coffee cup at the kitchen table. Grandma Mira took one look at me and didn't ask any questions. "You need to eat," she said, sliding a plate of eggs in front of me. "And then you need to rest." "I'll be fine on my own for a few hours. I can't sleep." "Then lie down and close your eyes. Even if you don't sleep, your body needs the rest." She sat down across from me, her face grim. "It's going to be a long few days, Victor. You need your strength." I ate the eggs without tasting them. I drank the coffee without feeling the caffeine. And then I went to my room and lay down on the bed, fully clothed, staring at the ceiling while the morning light slowly filled the room. I didn't sleep, but I did think. I thought about what Peterson had said, about the Powhatan and the things they had names for. I thought about my grandfather sitting at the same window watching the same treeing. I thought about my father dead in a tractor accident that had required a closed casket. And I thought about the shape I'd seen in the moonlight. The 2 broad shoulders, the 2 long arms, the pointed head that might have been a snout if the light had been better. I thought about all the stories I'd dismissed over the years. The encounters, the sightings, the people who swore they'd seen something in the woods that couldn't exist. I thought about how quickly we laugh at things we don't understand. How easy it is to call someone crazy or drunk or lying when they tell you they've seen the impossible. How we protect ourselves with disbelief because the alternative is too terrifying to consider. And I thought about how none of that mattered now because I'd seen it. I knew it was real. And tonight when the sun went down, It would be out there again watching me from the darkness with those intelligent greenish-gold eyes. I spent most of the day in a state of numb exhaustion. I went through the motions of helping Grandma Mira, but my mind was elsewhere, running in circles, trying to find a way out of what I'd witnessed. The rational part of me kept insisting there had to be an explanation. A large dog, a bear, a trick of the light and shadow. But the part of me that had seen those eyes, that had watched that silhouette move through the trees, knew better. Around 3:00 in the afternoon, I drove to the Horvath farm. Old man Horvath W. as out by his barn when I pulled up, mending a fence section with the slow, methodical movements of a man who'd been doing the same work for 60 years. He looked up when I got out of the truck and his face went carefully blank. "Starfall," he said, not offering his hand. "Heard you were back from Mira, that's right." I leaned against the fence trying to look casual. "Peterson said you lost some sheep recently." Horvath's jaw tightened. "Coyotes." "That's what you told people, but Peterson doesn't think it was coyotes. Peterson talks too much." I waited. The sun was warm on my back and somewhere in the barn a horse nickered softly. Horvath kept working on the fence, not looking at me, his hands moving with a precision that belied his age. "I saw something last night," I said finally at the tree end. "Something big, something that doesn't make sense." Horvath's hand stopped moving. He still didn't look at me, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. "You should go back to Oregon," he said quietly. "Take your grandmother with you. Sell the farm. Let the developers have it. There's nothing for you here but trouble." "What killed your sheep, Mr. Horvath?" He turned to me then, and his eyes were old and tired and filled with something that might have been fear. "I've lived on this land for 73 years. My father lived here before me and his father before him. 3 generations of Horvaths, and not one of us has ever talked about what lives in those woods. There's a reason for that, Starfall. Some things are better left alone. That's not an answer, no." He turned back to his fence. "It's not. Now get off my property. I've got work to do." I drove home in the slanting afternoon light, Horvath's words echoing in my head. 3 generations, maybe more. How long had people in this area been seeing things in the woods and keeping silent about them? How many encounters had been explained away as bear sightings or coyote attacks or the ravings of drunks and crazies? How many people had seen what I'd seen and decided it was safer to stay quiet? The sun was getting low again. I could feel the day slipping away from me, the darkness approaching with the inevitability of a train on a track. In a few hours, night would fall and whatever was out there would come out of hiding. And I would be here in this farmhouse on the edge of its territory with only 2 terrified dogs and an 87-year-old woman with a broken hip for company. I should have left. I know that now. I should have packed up Grandma Mira and driven her to Duke, checked her into a hotel and never looked back. But I didn't. I told myself it was because she had surgery on Monday and needed to rest, or because running would mean Clear's throat, admitting that what I'd seen was real. But the truth was simpler and more shameful than that. I wanted to see it again. Not up close, not in any way that would put me in danger, but I needed to see it. I needed to know what it was, what it looked like, whether my eyes and my memory could be trusted. The not knowing was worse than the fear. At least that's what I thought at the time. I helped Grandma Mira with dinner again. We ate in the same silence as the night before, broken only by the clatter of silverware and the occasional whine from Rex and Kaiser at the door. The light outside faded and the shadows lengthened, and I felt the familiar dread settling into my bones like cold water. "I'm going to sit on the porch for a while," I said, pushing back from the table. Grandma Mira looked at me like I'd announced I was going to take a swim in the creek. "Are you out of your mind?" "I need to see it. I need to know what we're dealing with. You don't need to know anything except how to stay inside after dark." She stood up, moving faster than I'd seen her move since I arrived, grabbing my arm with a grip that was surprisingly strong. "Victor, listen to me. Your grandfather tried to understand it. He spent years researching, investigating, trying to find an answer. It didn't help. It just made things worse. Whatever this thing is, it doesn't like being studied. It doesn't like being watched." "Then what am I supposed to do? Just hide inside and hope it goes away?" Yes, her eyes were fierce. "That's exactly what you're supposed to do. It's what your grandfather did after a while. It's what I've done for 30 years. You don't engage with it, Victor. You don't acknowledge it. You lock your doors and you close your curtains and you wait for morning. And if it decides to come through the door, she was quiet for a long moment. Then we pray, she said finally, because there's nothing else we can do. I didn't go out on the porch. I sat at my bedroom window instead, the curtains half open, watching the tree line as the last light faded from the sky. The moon was fuller tonight, nearly round, and it cast long shadows across the yard and the fields beyond. The cattle were clustered again, and Clear's throat, Rex and Kaiser, had settled into their low, constant whine. I waited. Around midnight, when my eyes were starting to ache from staring into the darkness, I saw movement. It came from the east, from the direction of the creek, moving through the pasture with that strange loping gait I'd glimpsed the night before. In the moonlight, I could see more detail than I'd expected. The broad shoulders, the powerful limbs, the long arms that nearly dragged on the ground when it walked on two legs. It was covered in fur, dark gray or black, matted and thick. And its head was wrong. Not human, not quite animal, something in between, something that belonged to neither category. A long snout, pointed ears, a jaw that seemed to stretch too far back into the skull. It was like looking at a wolf's head on a man's body, or a man's head twisted into the shape of a wolf's. Neither description fit exactly. Neither description captured the wrongness of what I was seeing. It stopped at the edge of the yard, maybe 50 ft from the house. It stood up straighter and I saw its full height for the first time. 8 ft, maybe more. Its arms hung at its sides and its hands. God, its hands. They weren't paws. They were hands with fingers and opposable thumbs, but the fingers were too long, too thin, and they ended in claws that curved like meat hooks. It turned its head toward my window. I ducked back, pressing myself against the wall, my heart hammering so loud I was sure it could hear me. Through the gap in the curtains, I could see it standing there motionless, its eyes catching the moonlight and reflecting it back in that sickly greenish gold. It knew I was watching. It had to know. Nothing moved like that without awareness, without intelligence. For an eternity, nothing happened. The creature stood in the yard and I hid in my bedroom, and the night stretched between us like a held breath. Then slowly, deliberately, it turned away and walked back toward the treeing. But before it disappeared into the darkness, it looked back over its shoulder, directly at my window, directly at me, and then it was gone. I didn't move for hours. I sat with my back against the wall, staring at the ceiling, trying to process what I'd seen. The details were sharp in my mind, too sharp, like they'd been burned there by a branding iron. The fur, the hands, the face that was neither human nor animal, but something terrible in between. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a big dog. It wasn't anything I could find in a field guide or a wildlife database. It was something else. Something that shouldn't exist. And it Clear's throat knew I was here. The sun rose eventually, flooding my room with light that should have been comforting but wasn't. I hadn't slept again. My body was running on fumes now, held upright by adrenaline and terror. I needed rest. I needed to think clearly. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face turning toward me, those eyes reflecting the moonlight. That mouth that might have been smiling or might have been something worse. I went downstairs and found Grandma Mira already at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in her hands, staring out the window at the fields beyond. "You saw it," she said without looking at me. I sat down across from her. "Yes. And now you understand why we don't talk about it." I thought about that for a moment. About a Peterson and his careful silence. About Horvath and his refusal to say what had killed his sheep. About all the people in this area who'd been living alongside something impossible for generations, never acknowledging it, never admitting it existed. "I understand," I said, "but understanding doesn't make it go away." She turned to look at me then, and her eyes were wet. "No," she said quietly, "it doesn't. It never does." We sat there in silence as the morning light grew stronger, and outside the cattle finally began to move, grazing as if nothing had happened, as if the night and its horrors had been nothing but a bad dream. But we both knew better. We both knew that tonight when the sun went down, it would be out there again, waiting, watching, remembering, and there was nothing either of us could do about it. The morning stretched on in silence, Grandma Mira and I sitting at that kitchen table like two survivors on a lifeboat, watching the horizon for sharks. The coffee grew cold in my hands. I couldn't drink it. My throat felt like I'd swallowed gravel, and my stomach churned with a combination of exhaustion and something deeper, something that had taken root in my gut and wouldn't let go. "How long?" I finally asked. "How long has it been here?" Grandma Mira sat down, her cup with a soft click against the saucer. Her hands were steady, steadier than mine, though I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself carefully like a woman expecting a blow. "Longer than me," she said. "Longer than your grandfather. His father used to tell stories back when people still talked about such things before the silence became the rule." "But what is it?" She shook her head slowly. "I don't know. Nobody knows. Your grandfather had theories. He read everything he could find about wolves and men and the old stories from the homeland. He thought maybe it was something that came over with the first settlers, or maybe something that was already here waiting. But theories don't help. When the sun goes down, I thought about the tracks by the creek, the eyes at the tree, the shape moving across the open field like a shadow given form. None of it made sense. None of it fit into the world I thought I knew. Why didn't you ever tell me?" The question came out sharper than I intended. "All those summers I spent here as a kid, all those nights sleeping in the barn during camping adventures. Why didn't you warn me?" Grandma Mira's expression softened, and for a moment she looked impossibly old, impossibly tired. "Would you have believed me? Would your parents have ever let you visit again?" She reached across the table and took my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Protected you. The only way we knew how. We watched. We made sure you were never out after dark, never alone in the fields, never in the wrong place at the wrong time. You were never in danger because we never let you be in danger." I thought back to those childhood summers, the way Grandpa Emile would call me inside as soon as the sun touched the horizon, the way they'd always find reasons to keep me close to the house after dinner. I'd assumed they were just old-fashioned, overprotective. I'd never questioned it. "The dogs knew," I said. "Rex and Kaiser, they've always known. Animals are smarter than we give them credit for. They don't waste time trying to explain away what their instincts tell them." She was right. I've been trying to explain it away since I arrived, convincing myself. The tracks were distorted. The silence was coincidence. The eyes were just a deer on a slope. But there was no explaining away what I'd seen last night. There was no rationalizing a creature that stood 8 feet tall with hands like a man and a face like a nightmare. I spent the rest of the day in a fog, going through the motions of helping Grandma Mira with her exercises, making lunch neither of us could eat, sitting on the porch, and staring at the tree like it might give up its secrets if I watched long enough. The dogs stayed close, pressed against our legs, their ears rotating constantly toward sounds I couldn't hear. Every gust of wind across the dead stubble made my heart jump. Every shadow at the edge of vision made me flinch. I stood on the porch and watched the afternoon shadows lengthen across the yard. The sun was still hours from setting, but already I could feel the dread building in my chest, a cold weight that got heavier with each passing minute. I didn't want to be here when night fell. I didn't want to see those eyes again, that shape against the moonlit corn. But I couldn't leave Grandma Mira. Not like this. Not with her hip, barely healed, and the creature circling the property like a shark around a wounded seal. Whatever was out there, whatever it wanted, I had to stay. I had to stay. The afternoon crept by with agonizing slowness. I tried to nap around 4, desperate for even an hour of sleep to sharpen my dulled senses. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face, the elongated snout, the pointed ears, the mouth that seemed to be forming something like a smile. I gave up after 20 minutes of staring at the ceiling, my heart racing at every creak of the old house. Instead, I did what I always do when I'm scared. I worked. There was a tractor in the barn that hadn't run in years, and I spent the late afternoon tearing into the engine, cleaning carburetors, replacing spark plugs, losing myself in the familiar language of machines. It helped a little. Grease and metal made sense. Problems that could be diagnosed and fixed. Causes and effects that followed rational rules. But even in the barn, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing at the open door, at the rectangle of daylight that seemed to shrink with each passing hour. The barn was large and shadowed, full of old equipment and hay bales and dark corners where anything could be hiding. I found myself positioning my body so I could always see the exit, always have a clear path to run if I needed to. When had I become this person? This jumpy, paranoid man who flinched at shadows and listened for footsteps that weren't there. 43 years I'd lived in this world, most of them doing hard work in rough places, dealing with loggers and truckers and the occasional drunk who wanted to start trouble. I'd never been scared of much, but this was different. This was fear at a level I'd never experienced before. A deep primal terror that bypassed my rational mind and went straight to something ancient in my Hindi brain. The part of me that still remembered when our ancestors huddled in caves, listening to things moving in the dark, knowing the night belonged to predators we couldn't fight, couldn't reason with, couldn't understand. That's what this creature was. I realized a predator, something that had existed alongside humanity since the beginning, hunting us from the shadows, taking the unwary and the unlucky while the rest of us pretended it wasn't real. We'd built our cities and our civilization and told ourselves we'd conquered nature. But out here in the cornfields of Illinois, nature had teeth and claws and eyes that reflected moonlight in colors that shouldn't exist. The sun touched the horizon around 7:30. I'd finished with the tractor by then, had cleaned up and gone back inside, had helped Grandma Mira eat dinner, even though neither of us was hungry. We sat in the living room with every light on. Rex and Kaiser lying across the doorway like furry sentinels, their eyes never leaving the windows. "You should try to sleep," Grandma Mira said. "You look like death warmed over." "I could say the same about you," she smiled faintly. "I've lived with this for 50 years. You get used to it. Do you really?" The smile faded. "No, not really, but you learn to function. You learn to put it in a box in your mind, take it out only when you have to. Otherwise, it would drive you mad." I thought about all those years she'd spent here, night after night knowing what was out there. All those years my grandfather had spent walking the perimeter with his rifle, checking the locks, lying awake, listening for sounds that didn't belong. A lifetime of vigilance, a lifetime of fear, carefully controlled and hidden from the grandchildren who visited in the summer. "Why did you stay?" I asked. "You could have moved, gone somewhere else." "This is our land," she said simply. "4 generations. Your grandfather's buried here out by the old oak tree. My whole life is here." She paused, looking at the window with an expression I couldn't read. And besides, running doesn't always help. Some things follow. I didn't ask what she meant by that. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. The night deepened around us, the darkness outside the windows becoming absolute. The lights in the living room created a bubble of false security, pushing back the shadows but not defeating them. Beyond the glass, the farm existed in a different world, a world of hunting and being hunted, of ancient things moving through the dark of eyes that watched and waited and remembered. Around 10:00, I went to check the barn. I told myself it was necessary. I'd left tools out, hadn't properly secured the tractor, needed to make sure the doors were locked. But really, I think I needed to know, needed to confront the darkness to prove to myself that I wasn't a coward. I took the big flashlight from the kitchen drawer and stepped out onto the porch. The dogs whined but didn't follow. They knew better. The night was cool and still, that same unnatural silence pressing against my ears like cotton. No crickets, no frogs, no wind rustling the corn. Just the sound of my own footsteps on the gravel and the hammering of my heart in my chest. The barn was maybe 100 yards from the house. In daylight, it was a quick walk. Unremarkable. In the dark, with that silence and that knowledge of what was out there, it felt like crossing an ocean. I swept the flashlight beam across the yard, checking the shadows, looking for movement. Nothing, just the usual shapes. The fence posts, the old well, the pile of lumber that had been sitting there since my grandfather's time. The beam trembled slightly, betraying the fear I was trying to control. 50 yards. The barn loomed ahead, a black shape against the slightly lighter sky. The doors were closed just as I'd left them. No sign of disturbance, no indication that anything was wrong. But the smell hit me when I was 20 yards away. It was the smell from the woods. That rich, musky odor like wet fur and copper and something rotten underneath. It rolled over me in a wave so strong I could taste it on the back of my tongue, and I stopped dead in my tracks. The barn doors were closed, but the smell was coming from inside. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to turn around and sprint back to the house and lock every door and pray that whatever was in there hadn't noticed me yet. But I couldn't move. My legs had locked, my muscles seized by that same paralysis I'd felt the first night when I'd seen the eyes at the tree. The flashlight beam shook violently as I raised it toward the barn. The doors were definitely closed. I could see the padlock I'd put there myself still hanging from the hasp, but there was a gap at the bottom of the door, maybe 6 in between the wood and the ground. And as I watched, something moved in that gap. Something black. Something that gleamed wetly in the flashlight beam. A hand, not a paw. A hand with fingers that were too long and too thin, tipped with claws that curved like fish hooks. It slid through the gap under the door, reaching toward me, and I saw. The texture of the fur, not smooth and sleek like a dog's, but coarse and matted, like the hair of something that spent clear's throughout its life in dark places, in mud and blood and rotting things. The hand felt along the ground, fingers spread as if searching for something. For me, a sound escaped my throat. Not a scream, not a word, just a raw noise of primal terror. The hand stopped, the fingers curled, and then slowly it withdrew. I heard movement inside the barn. Heavy footsteps, the creak of wood, something large shifting its weight. Then that smell grew stronger and I realized the creature was pressing itself against the door. That only an inch of old wood separated me from something that could tear me apart without effort. Breathing. Heavy rasping breathing. Loud enough that I could hear it clearly from like 20 yards away. And underneath the breathing, that same almost sound I'd heard before. That vocalization that wasn't quite a growl and wasn't quite a word. The flashlight died in my hand. I don't know if the batteries finally gave out or if something else happened. All I know is that one moment I could see the barn, the door, that gap at the bottom, and the next moment I was standing in absolute darkness. With that smell washing over me and that breathing filling the night, I ran. I don't remember the decision to move. My body just acted, turning and sprinting toward the house with a speed I didn't know I had. I couldn't see anything, couldn't orient myself. Just ran toward where I thought the lights were, my feet pounding the gravel, my breath tearing at my throat. Behind me I heard the barn door explode outward. The sound was enormous. Wood splintering, metal screaming, a crash clear's throat that seemed to shake the ground. And then footsteps behind me. Not the four-legged gallop of a running animal, but something else. Something that alternated between 2 legs and 4. Something that was gaining on me with terrifying speed. I could feel it closing the distance, feel its presence like a weight on my back, like heat from an open flame. The smell was all around me now, filling my lungs with every gasping breath. And I knew that I wasn't going to make it. That I was going to die here in the dark of my grandmother's farm, torn apart by something that shouldn't exist. The porch light appeared ahead of me, a golden beacon in the darkness, impossibly far away, 40 yards 30. The footsteps behind me were louder now, heavier, and I could hear that breathing, could feel it on the back of my neck. 20 yard 10. I hit the porch steps at full speed, stumbled, crashed through the front door and slammed it behind me. Rex and Kaiser were barking. Grandma Mira was shouting something, and I threw myself against the door, bracing my weight against it, waiting for the impact that would splinter the wood and end everything. Nothing. The barking subsided. The night outside was silent. I stayed pressed against the door for a long time, my chest heaving, my hands shaking so badly. I couldn't have held a cup without spilling it. Grandma was beside me saying something, asking questions, but I couldn't process the words. All I could think about was that hand sliding under the barn door, those claws gleaming in the flashlight beam, the sound of the door exploding outward as the creature came after me. Victor, Victor, look at me, I blinked. Grandma Mira was standing in front of me, her hands on my shoulders, her eyes searching my face. Did it touch you? I shook my head. No, I don't think so. Are you sure? Did it scratch you, bite you, anything? No, I ran. I ran. She exhaled slowly, some tension leaving her body. Good, that's good. The barn, I said. It was in the barn. It broke through the door. She nodded like this wasn't surprising. It's been getting bolder. Your grandfather noticed it too toward the end. Like it was tired of watching, like it wanted something more. I slid down the door until I was sitting on the floor, my back against the wood, my legs stretched out in front of me. Rex came and pressed Clear's throat, his head against my thigh, whining softly. I put my hand on his fur, feeling the warmth, the reality of him. What does it want? I asked. What the hell does it want from us? Grandma Mira didn't answer. She just looked at the door behind me, her expression unreadable, and I knew she didn't have an answer because there wasn't one. Clear as throat, the creature wasn't something that could be understood, negotiated with, explained away. It was simply what it was, a predator, ancient and patient, circling the edges of human civilization and taking what it wanted. And tonight, for whatever reason, it had wanted me. I slept on the floor of Grandma Mere's room that night, Rex and Kaiser lying across the doorway. It wasn't really sleep, more like a series of micro-collapses where exhaustion overwhelmed terror for a few minutes at a time before the nightmares shocked me awake. Again, clear as throat, every time I closed my eyes, I saw that hand, those claws, that shape exploding through the barn door. When morning finally came, gray and drizzling, I went outside to survey the damage. The barn door was destroyed. Not just broken, destroyed. Reduced to splinters and twisted metal hinges and fragments scattered across the ground for 20 ft. The force required to do that, to take a solid oak door and tear through it like tissue paper. I couldn't process it. A bear might have been strong enough, maybe a really,